Today we're going to be cooking grains and legumes. Now, let me begin by telling you a quick story. 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, our nomadic ancestors wandered out of Africa to the eastern Mediterranean, and they found a veritable Garden of Eden. The conditions were perfect for abundant vegetation. Among that vegetation, stands of wild grain. Now, they had a big idea, and that idea took hold pretty quickly. The idea was simply this: rather than wandering as nomads in search of food, shelter, and water, maybe we could stay put and manipulate our environment to give us those things that we need for survival. That big idea was the seed out of which modern agriculture grew. From that day to this, almost every culture has hitched their wagon to some combination of grains and beans. And there's a good reason for it. This combination, nutritionally, is a powerhouse. Together, grains and legumes will give you complete protein, especially in the absence of abundant meat. So think about it for a second. In Asia, they have rice and beans, soybeans probably. In India, they eat rice and all manner of lentils. Here in the United States, we eat wheat and beans. We have peanut butter, and we have that with corn and bread. You get the idea. There's all kinds of grains out there. There's oats, there's wheat, there's rye, there's barley, sorghum, wild rice, quinoa, teff. It sort of boggles the mind, but every culture, it seems, has hitched their wagon to some grain to fuel their existence, and likely combined it with some bean as well. Let's get cooking. I'm going to start with beans, so let me take these grains away, and we'll bring these over. You can see here I have garbanzos, black beans, cranberry beans, and cannellini beans. I want to talk a little bit about cooking beans. So let's get things rolling. There's a sheet pan here, or a cookie sheet you might call it. Beans are an agricultural product, minimally processed, so it's not a bad idea to spread them out and see if there's not little pieces of dirt or even a stone or two. Spread them out like this, and you may find just something like this. You may also see some old or broken beans that you want to discard, and those go right into the garbage. We'll take those and put them back into a bowl. And these beans now are ready to be washed and then soaked. I'm going to set them aside. What I have here is some beans that have been washed and soaked. They should be soaked in abundant water. So typically I have 2 or 3 times as much water as beans. I don't want them to ever go dry. So if they're so thirsty that they drink up 2 times as much water, then 3, I think, is appropriate. 3 times as much water as beans, and I let them soak overnight. Usually I'll put them in the refrigerator because at the end of the day, beans still represent protein, and I don't want them to be sitting at room temperature. We're going to take these beans and put them into a pot. And I'm going to top just a little bit more water so they're covered by about a half an inch to an inch. And we'll turn them on and begin cooking them. Let's say you don't have enough time to let them soak overnight. Maybe you forgot. Maybe you were busy. There's a quick soak method that you can use where you take the beans, cover them with abundant water, bring them up to one boil them for a minute or 2, and then turn off the heat and let them sit for an hour or so before you carry on. Now, there's a good reason not to do that every time. If they soak and rehydrate slowly overnight, chances are the beans will get fuller and will be less likely to break apart when you cook them. I have a pot of beans right here that have been cooking for some time now. I'm going to dip in there. They've swollen a little bit. They're probably twice the size they were when they were raw. And what I want to do is talk about evaluating doneness. They've been cooking for an hour. I think beans like this take about an hour, hour and a quarter. So take a bean out, and what you want to do is just put it between your thumb and forefinger and smear it. And if it feels grainy or coarse or anything but velvety smooth, those beans are not cooked yet. All right. I have another pot of beans that's cooked all the way, and if I grab one of those beans and I smear it between my thumb and forefinger, it's just velvety. There's no white chalkiness to this bean at all. You can also pop it in your mouth, and maybe that's an easier way to test it because your mouth is very sensitive. If it feels dry, sandy, grainy, chalky, those are beans that are not yet fully cooked. So, we've got it cooking here for about an hour. I want to talk briefly about flavoring. In this particular pot, I'm going to flavor it with some herbs and garlic. Whole cloves of garlic can go in there. I put in 3 cloves. You might choose to flavor it with a branch of sage, which I have here, but I'm going to put rosemary. Maybe a 6 or 8 inch piece of rosemary in there, and a couple of bay leaves. That's all. So that can cook very happily, and the beans will absorb the flavor of the garlic and the herbs as they cook. If you have these beans on for more than an hour, hour and a half, and they just don't seem to be getting done, you have to ask yourself what the problem is. It could be simply that they're old beans, that they're extra dry and they need more time to cook. But more likely, there's another problem, and that other problem is that beans don't like salt early on. It keeps them from getting tender, and they don't like acid especially. That can keep them from getting tender. So if you have a pot that's been cooking for an hour and a half and it's not nearly done, I would say if you haven't added salt, chances are your water is hard, and that extra acidity is keeping the beans from cooking to tenderness. There's a little test you can do. I've got some baking soda here which will react to acidity. If I take a little pinch and I add it to the pot, you can see it start to bubble up. That is the acidity in this water responding to this baking soda, and that baking soda will neutralize the acidity. That wasn't a particularly active response, but if you have very hard water, sometimes it'll bubble up. Don't add a lot of baking soda to the water to neutralize acidity, because ultimately it can make your beans just fall apart altogether. Instead, a little pinch. I would say in a pot like this, any more than 1/4 of a teaspoon is too much. So a little pinch, and just test to see if that's the issue. And if you see a response, then 1/4 of a teaspoon, no more. Too much baking soda, and your beans will start to taste a little bit soapy, and that's not something you want. So let me move this aside, and we'll bring these beans over that are cooked. Once they're tender, once you've smeared it between thumb and forefinger, then you can think about adding salt. And I've got some salt in here already, but I'm going to add a little bit more. Because these are white beans, I'm not going to use black pepper, but instead some pepper flakes, which gives me a nice little fleck of color. You can see that I still have the rosemary in here, and that can live there very happily. I want to take a little bit of this water and just taste it with you. It's like one of the best vegetable stocks you've ever eaten. The starch in those beans gives a very distinctive body to the cooking liquid. I can taste the bay and the rosemary, the pepper flakes and the garlic. Do yourself a favor and never, ever throw that out. In fact, beans should be stored in liquid. So keep them in that liquid, cool them in that liquid. Because we've added salt, that will help them hold their shape now that they're cooked, and everything's right with the world. So well-cooked beans are a staple in my kitchen. Once you've cooked them, you might put them in a little plastic container like this with their liquid, cool them down, and then keep them either in the refrigerator or they freeze really well too. Now that you have cooked beans on hand in your pantry, you are ready for a lot of different preparations. Maybe the simplest would be to take a bowl and get some of these beans, scoop them up, put them right into a bowl with some of their cooking liquid, which is delicious, and then serve them simply with a really punchy olive oil. If you like the idea of sage, I'll put a couple of leaves of sage here. That could be chopped up and added. If you had cooked these beans, let's say, with a little piece of leftover ham or some bacon, it would also have a meaty, smoky flavor to that broth. But just as they are, I think they're delicious, assuming they're properly cooked, velvety, and you've held on to the well-seasoned water that they cooked in. Here's some other ideas for dishes that you can make when you have cooked beans on hand. Here, for instance, is a spinach salad. And the spinach salad has tuna with a garlicky mayonnaise and white beans. Very, very simple, but really delicious. A big squeeze of lemon and off you go. Here is a dish that has bitter greens, garlic and tomatoes mixed in. I've served it here with a little piece of sautéed chicken, but even on its own it tastes delicious. This is also the start of a great pasta dish, orecchietta with beans and a little bit of bitter greens and tomato. And then finally, a piece of fish that's been braised with white beans, fish stock, and saffron. A little drizzle of Pernod, a squeeze of lemon juice, and this right here is the flavors of the south of France captured in one plate. There is a whole world of grains out there for you to enjoy. We need to narrow our focus just a little bit so that we can learn some techniques that you might find valuable. So I've decided that we'll cook some rice today. And I pulled together a couple of different rices. Let me just talk about these briefly. Here I've got short grain rice. And short grain rice is the type of rice that's used in sushi, also in risotto, which we'll be making a little later on. It's about twice as long as it is fat. And the thing that makes it distinctive is that when it cooks, the starch is very, very sticky. So making a risotto will leverage that starchiness to create a wonderful creamy sauce. Just the same way that in Japan they leverage that stickiness to create a rice that will stick together into fingers or rolls. Now, in the middle here, what I have is medium grain rice. This is about 3 times as long as it is fat, and it cooks up significantly less sticky than short grain rice, especially if you know a technique like pilaf, which we'll be using here in a second. And then finally, long grain rice is about 5 times as long as it is fat. This particular rice is basmati rice, an aromatic rice, and when this cooks up, it tends to cook up very soft and fluffy. It doesn't stick together at all. Now, I have an outlier here. This is whole grain rice. This is brown rice, whole grain brown rice that's short grain. This has the bran layer intact, also the germ. So there's plenty of nutrition, but more than that, because of the bran, it takes longer to cook. If this rice cooks in 15 minutes, this rice takes nearly 45 minutes. There is an example of a whole grain that cooks very quickly, and I thought you might enjoy seeing it. This is quinoa. And quinoa, because it's so small, it cooks in about 15 minutes, even though it's a whole grain with the bran and the fiber intact. So I'm going to make a rice pilaf. It's a great technique for taking rice and keeping it loose and fluffy. It cooks the grain in a measured amount of liquid. So you need to know what grain you're beginning with. Otherwise, you won't be able to measure the correct amount of liquid. We're going to cook basmati rice, and this uses about 1 part rice to 1.5 to 1 3/4 parts liquid. Take a look at what I have on the stove. I have a pan, and in here I've sautéed some onions. They've already turned translucent. I just turned the heat up. And what we're going to do is take this rice and add it to this pan and coat the grains with the flavorful fat that's already inherent in this pan. Give each grain a little oily coat to wear, which will protect it from sticking to other grains of rice. The other thing that's going to happen is that as I cook this rice, the outside starch on each grain of rice will gelatinize with the heat, and that gelatinized starch will give sort of a firm little coat to every grain of rice so that it's distinct and doesn't stick to its neighbor. There's a couple of clues that the starches are gelatinizing. What you'll probably notice is that the rice goes from translucent to a little bit white and chalky. It may begin to brown just a little bit, and you'll notice a little toasty, nutty flavor coming off of this pan. So already, 20 seconds in, the rice is about half opaque. We'll give it a little bit more time to cook, but I would say total, 1.5 minutes is enough. While this continues to cook, I have a measured amount of liquid here. I'm going to cook this rice in chicken stock. You can use plain water if you'd like. You can use vegetable stock. But chicken stock is what we'll be using today. And as flavorings, I'm going to add a branch of bay, a branch of thyme, a couple of bay leaves, and maybe just a pinch of pepper flakes. All right, we're ready to move on. So in goes the measured amount of chicken stock. And stir that all together. It's important that this be seasoned, so add salt as though you were seasoning a soup. It should taste like a well-seasoned broth. I will introduce the branches of thyme and a couple of bay leaves. If you like it spicy, some pepper flakes. I probably wouldn't put black pepper into a rice like this, because if you do, you'll see little black specks against something that is basically white, and it becomes a little bit noticeable. Before we move ahead, I'll just taste this broth like a well-seasoned soup. So we'll set that aside. This is going to come up to a boil, so high heat. Make sure it's not sticking. Give it one good stir, and then we're going to reduce the heat very, very low so that we maintain a simmer and cook it. Now, when I was taught to make rice pilaf with white rice like this, the instructor that taught me said 17 minutes and 32 seconds. And I said, really? 17 minutes, 32 seconds? He said, if I told you between 15 and 18 minutes, you would likely forget. So 17 minutes, 32 seconds. But in a practical way, all of the moisture should be absorbed. The rice should be tender. And at that point, you can turn the heat off. Let it sit for about 5 minutes, because as soon as it's cooked, the rice can be a little bit delicate. You don't want to manipulate it too much, otherwise you'll break up the grains. So this is just coming up to a simmer now, and I'll turn the heat down, maintain that bare simmer, put a lid on. We need the proper size pan for making a pilaf like this. We need a pan that has a tight-fitting lid. We need a pan that when we put the rice in, it's no deeper than about 3 inches. So nothing too narrow. We don't want the rice to be so deep that it has difficulty cooking through. So no deeper than 3 inches, and as it cooks, it will double in size, and it'll probably swell up between 4 and 5 inches total. This pot is perfect for the amount of rice that I'm cooking. I'm going to pull this off. 17 minutes and 32 seconds have gone by, and I have a pilaf that is already done. If you tilt it, there should be no loose liquid that pours to the side. You don't want any excess liquid. It all should have been absorbed. If you taste the rice, it should be tender, and it should be properly seasoned. Now, let it rest for a short time, and then to finish it, what I like to do is add a little bit of butter to the rice, grab yourself a fork, and fluff the rice very, very gently. Don't stir it with a spoon, don't be too aggressive. Just fluff it with a fork and turn that butter in there, and that will flavor the rice. Along the way, you may find the remnants of your thyme, which can come out. Likewise, the bay leaf. And this rice pilaf is done. So start to finish, it really only takes 20 minutes. You can see how loose the rice is. It sort of falls very, very loose. That's the beauty of the pilaf method. Pilaf, start to finish, 20 minutes. It's a great technique to have in your arsenal. Having made a pilaf where we cooked rice in a measured amount of liquid, I want to show you some other grains. Let's say, for argument's sake, you don't know how much liquid that grain should cook in. You can cook grains as well in water the way you might cook pasta. You probably won't need so much water, but cover it with liquid and then go ahead and turn the heat on and cook it. So I have barley, I have bulgur. Here is 2 different colors of quinoa and some wheat berries. Cook them in abundant water, and then at the end, the only downside I can see is that possibly the water-soluble nutrients would go down the drain unless you repurpose that cooking liquid in another preparation. Maybe you add it to a soup. As those grains cook, and they'll take different times depending on what grain they are, you might choose to flavor them. And I show you here a number of different options. In Northern Europe, for instance, you might add carrot and onion, garlic, and a selection of herbs, a sachet de piece with a little mirepoix. In Italy, it may be olive oil, garlic, oregano, and onion makes its way into the pot with the grain as it cooks. In Asia, maybe it's ginger and garlic and scallions. And if you like the idea of seasoning it with some soy, you could do that as well. And maybe you've already had Mexican red rice, where they take all of the ingredients that make up a salsa, and that salsa is part of the liquid that the grain cooks in. Let me show you something that I like to do. These whole grains take a good deal of time to cook, about 45 minutes or so. And so oftentimes, if I'm cooking them anyways, I'll make extra that I can keep in the refrigerator or even in the freezer. And if I had just made a rice pilaf, I love the idea of adding other grains to it. So I'm going to put some lentils that are pre-cooked and I have on hand. This gives me that wonderful nutritional powerhouse combination of grain and legume. And then you could even add a few of these cooked grains. There's some barley as well, maybe a little bit of wheat berry. I'm going to put some parsley in there, and you'll see that when we stir this together, you get a dish that is complex in flavor, but more than that, has a wonderful visual texture. Let me put it out on a plate so you get a chance to see it. We've made a rice pilaf. Here's that same pilaf turned into a grain medley. And when we come back, we'll be making a wild mushroom risotto with short grain rice. Next, I'd like to make a risotto, another rice preparation. And this preparation takes advantage of the starch in a short grain rice and leverages it so that it turns into a creamy sauce. It's really a great technique. I'm going to make a wild mushroom risotto. You can see there's a nice selection of mushrooms here. What I'd like to do is get some of these cut up, and I'll put them on to saute, and then we'll talk through the technique of risotto. So I've got some shiitake mushrooms. The stems should come out. I've got some other wild mushrooms here. I'm going to take those and put them here. We'll cut the shiitakes in a nice dice. And I've even got some trumpet royale. These are a great looking mushroom. I'm going to leave it in big pieces so that they're easy to identify. No sense in going to all the expense of buying these mushrooms just to cut them up so small you don't know what they are. All right. I'm going to bring this pan up to heat. When you make a risotto, you can think of it in very distinct parts. First, there's a foundation of flavor. In our case, it's going to be a little bit of pancetta with garlic and onions. Second, there's the rice that goes into the pan and the broth that it cooks in. Here we're using chicken stock that's been seasoned. I should have about 4 times as much stock as rice. So 4 times as much stock as rice, that's safe. And then finally, at the end, there's a garnish that makes its way into your risotto. So foundational flavor, rice and broth, and then the garnish. And for us, the garnish is going to be these wonderful wild mushrooms. Pan is nice and hot. You can see the oil creeping, and it's going to start to smoke in just a second. That's my clue that I need to put something in there so that it doesn't burn. Now, I want to see if I can get some color on these mushrooms, so I start them in a hot, hot pan, and then when I see some color and they're just beginning to get tender, I'm going to put the garlic in. Garlic in at the end so that it doesn't burn. I can season it right now with salt and pepper. Nothing really enhances the flavor of mushroom like a really high heat sear. That caramelization brings out a meatiness in mushrooms that's undeniable. It's really delicious. Having a selection of mushrooms like this gives us a depth of flavor and a complexity that you won't get from just a single mushroom. If you were using dried mushrooms, you could rehydrate them in liquid, and then that liquid could become part of the broth that you cook your risotto in. Now that I'm starting to see a little bit of color on these mushrooms, I'm going to introduce some thyme and also some garlic. And I want to be careful not to burn that garlic. Just a splash of white wine. Those mushrooms are fine. They're done. They're seasoned. They taste great. I'm going to set them aside. We'll revisit those a little bit later on after we've made our rice. Back to the risotto. I'm going to start with foundational flavor, and in this case it's going to be some pancetta that I add to the pan, and I want to render the fat out of this pancetta and start to brown it just a little bit. If you're in a hurry, you can dice this up even smaller. You can almost mince it into very fine pieces of meat, and it will cook very, very quickly. I think of this not as a large garnish that I want to look at, but just a foundational flavor, something that's rich and full and meaty. Next, I'm going to add some onions to this pan, and we'll let those cook right along with the pancetta. If you see the meat leaving behind a little bit of a residue on the bottom of the pan, don't let that burn. It's pure flavor. The way to deal with it is just to introduce a tiny amount of liquid and clean the bottom of the pot up. Sort of scrape that brown off of the bottom. And that way you won't have burnt flavors in your risotto. The rest of the garlic and thyme is going to make its way into the pan. And this represents our foundation of flavor. Next, our short grain arborio rice goes in. And we're going to coat this rice in flavorful fat. And the first addition of liquid is going to be wine. Now, as I cook this, let me sort of explain the process. As I said, there's a particular type of starch that tends to be really sticky. And while pilaf tries to sidestep any stickiness in rice, here in a risotto, we're going to celebrate that stickiness. We're going to use that starch to make a wonderful creamy sauce. The way to tease the starch out of this grain is to add small amounts of liquid and then stir this preparation almost constantly. So you can see I added about 1/2 to 3/4 of a cup of wine, and I stir this at a low temperature so that it maintains a simmer. And off we go. The broth I have hot already so that when I add it, I don't have to wait for it to come up to temperature. And as I said, this should be seasoned already. Now, if you look in this pan, what you'll notice is that first addition of wine has been absorbed. And it's starting to even become a little bit creamy at this early point. Next, I'm going to introduce more stock, but do it incrementally, a little bit at a time. If you give too much liquid, it's almost as if the texture of the grain is spoiled. It gives up a little bit too easy. What you want to do is tease the starch out of this by stirring it and adding liquid incrementally. The reason for the stirring, obviously, is that there's not so much liquid to cover all the rice, and so that which is out of the liquid needs to be stirred down into the liquid so that it can cook properly. Start to finish, a risotto will take you about 18 minutes. And across the 18 minutes, you will be involved with stirring and adding liquid as you go. There's an alternative that I call risotto interruptus. I don't know if that's the true term, but what I'm going to do is add liquid until the rice is about halfway cooked, and then I can take it out of the pan, put it out flat on a cookie sheet so that it can cool quickly, and I can bring it back to the stove shortly before I want to eat it and make the final additions of stock and end up with a dish that is done in 10 minutes rather than 20, so I don't have to leave my guests for so long. Still in all, risotto demands your attention at the end. It's not something that you can make ahead. And if you look in the pan now, you'll start to recognize the creamy sauce that's beginning to take shape. That is exactly as it should be. Before a new addition of liquid, we'll let this cook down and become almost dry, and then we'll move on. What type of a pan is appropriate for a preparation like this? If I used a broad pan, if I used a sautoir, there would be so much surface area, it would be more difficult to stir, but I would also get a lot of evaporation, and consequently, I might run out of stock. If I take a pan that is too close, maybe it's difficult to maintain a simmer. So, a pan that is the right size for the job, I think, is what you want. I have the rice here. It's about 2 inches thick in the bottom of the pan, and I feel pretty good about this pan for making this risotto. If you look, a lot of the liquid has been absorbed, and so we move on and add more. We'll carry on this way for about 15 minutes. And then I would suggest you get in and you take a grain of rice and you taste it. You make sure that it is starting to get tender. If it's not ready to go, there'll be a chalky, hard center to each grain of rice. If you take a single grain and bite into it and look at the cross-section, you'll see that white, chalky center. You need to continue to cook until that has gone away. All right, if you look into this pan now, you can see it's very creamy. I'm going to taste the rice, and it is what the Italians would say al dente, to the tooth. It still is firm, but tender. I'm going to take the mushrooms and add them to the risotto right now. This is the garniture that's making its way into our dish, and this will give the mushrooms an opportunity to flavor this risotto. From this point on, as we approach completion, it's important to monitor the texture of your risotto, because if you add too much liquid, it will be soupy. If you don't add enough liquid, it will be dry. So just keep your eye on the prize. Think with the end in mind. Traditionally, you finish risotto with butter and you finish risotto with cheese. And so I'm going to take care of that right now. I'm going to add a knob of butter. And I'm going to grate some cheese into the risotto. And it's a good idea to do this before you evaluate the finished seasoning, because the richness and the salty, savory flavor of the cheese will impact the finished dish. At this point, as the rice approaches completion, be a little bit careful that you don't stir too aggressively. Sort of fold things in. And what you really want is a preparation that holds its shape, but just barely. So it should hold its shape on a spoon without running off and being too liquid. Needs a little salt. I'm going to add some pepper. And at this point, as we approach completion, I'm going to take some green herbs. I've got chives and I've got parsley, and we'll introduce those into the risotto as well. And stir them in. By adding them right at the end, they'll hold on to their fresh flavor and bright green color. I think I'd like just a little more cheese. Risotto is a rich preparation, and a lot of people don't understand that. I worked for a chef once who, if you called and said, "Could you make a risotto without cheese or butter?" he would say, "I'll do almost anything, but I'm not willing to do that." And that's always stuck with me. Okay, I'm going to turn the heat off. The rice is tender. It holds its shape on the spoon, but it's still moist. It barely holds its shape. This is a wild mushroom risotto. I could make a risotto that has shrimp or seafood in it, and that seafood would be added towards the end. I could make a spring vegetable risotto with peas and asparagus and baby carrots. And over the top, just a little more cheese. This might be something that happens at the table. You take it out and each person can add a little cheese to their own taste. I love the look of a little bit of dark pepper. And that's Risotto 101.